Greetings to those of you who are the first to arrive for our second Lenten talk that we are hosting through the diocese in order for people who are housebound during this period of the coronavirus and adjacent restrictions on movement and so on, so that people will nevertheless be able to have some spiritual discussion and conversation about spiritual and Christian themes during a period when so much of the conversation around the world is all to do with sickness and the virus and associated political and cultural things. As I said earlier in the week, it's very essential that we have ample opportunity also to talk about other things, spiritual things, so that this period doesn't become one that is simply dedicated to worrying about things that in most ways we cannot control ourselves in any case. We will just have a few introductory remarks to give people time to. I want to thank you to everyone who helped with putting this together for the initial one on Monday. This is the second now on Wednesday. We had a much bigger turnout than I was thinking. About 175 people were watching us live on Monday, and well over 3,500 have watched since. I suppose this is good evidence that such things are needed. That is to say, material on the internet and certainly in media form that isn't to do with all things coronavirus. A few small remarks, if I can, before we start on the talk for this evening proper. I'm told from the people who run these things and help me with them that after Monday's talk, very, very many of you tried to be in touch with me via Facebook, Facebook Messenger or Messages or whatever they are. Please be aware, I do not personally use Facebook in any way whatsoever. Nor do I intend to start doing so. So it's not possible to contact me via Facebook, via messages or any other form. We use Facebook with the diocese purely as a way of disseminating information, usually in terms of links to materials that are on the website of our diocese or our parishes. And then occasionally, this is something new that we've actually used this feature to be able to speak live with video. But I personally do not use Facebook. There is an account in my name that's used by individuals in the diocese to help on my behalf put things onto the page for our diocese. But I don't use Facebook Messenger or any other form of this service. So please don't try to contact me that way. You'll simply be left waiting because I don't read those things. If there's a reason for you to be in contact with me, you're certainly welcome to do so. And you can find the means of being in touch with me via the website of our diocese, which is orthodox-europe.org. And finally, we have put together a program for the next week or so. This is our second talk. We'll have another one on Friday, and then another 3 next week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. It's far more than I would normally do in terms of giving Lenten talks in person in a week's time. However, I do realize that many people are shut up at home, and for many people this is an unusual experience, and for this reason we're trying to provide a little more than normal for you to engage with. And then one other housekeeping reminder before we get started with the talk tonight, which is to say that our diocese is continuing this coming weekend and in the weeks ahead to provide materials for those of you who are at home and cannot come to the services in your parish at the weekend, or this coming week, as it's the 5th week of Lent. There are services on Wednesday and Friday and so on. A great many of you, the majority of you in many places, are not able to be in the churches because of these temporary restrictions that are in place. The services are carrying on, led by the priests, who are carrying on the tradition that has been with us since the time of the Old Testament, of the priests standing for the people and offering prayers on their behalf. Normally we like to do this together with the people, but in certain circumstances, such as that we're facing now, this is not always possible. The priests carry on this ministry for you and for the world all the same. When you can't be in the church, it's good to pray along at home in some of the same words and prayers that are being offered in the temples. And so we're providing for you, as we did this last weekend, all of the hymns for this coming Sunday from the Triodion. Those are the Lenten hymns dedicated to St. John of the Ladder this coming Sunday. We're providing you the hymns from the Mineon of the specific saints commemorated on Sunday itself. And these are both in English and in Church Slavonic. We'll also be providing the Ladder of Divine Ascent, which is the main work of St. John, whose memory we keep. And this will be provided in Russian, English, and French. These are the three main languages of our diocese here. And we also will continue to provide you with a set of readers' prayers for the time of an epidemic, gathered specifically for this moment that people are facing. All of that will be available probably from Friday on the website of our diocese for you to access anywhere and pray at home with your priests. And we will, as I say, be providing similar things for each of the main Lenten days ahead. So I think that's the main housekeeping done. So I said in the announcement that our theme tonight would be the foundations of prayer, and specifically prayer of the lips and prayer of the heart. People ask constantly about prayer. How do we do it? What is it? How do we grow within it? How do we advance within it? Even yesterday, or Monday rather, when we had our first talk, some of the questions that were being posed about prayer, even though that was not specifically our subject on Monday. Tonight it will be, and as we did last time, God willing, we'll have some time at the end for a few questions, if you have them, practical questions about prayer. But I wanted to talk about the essence of how we go about growing in prayer. We all understand, or at least I pray that we all understand, and if we don't, then there is the need most certainly for some extra catechesis. People should understand that prayer is ultimately, in its highest form, not a conversation with God, not a set of words that we lay before Him, but a condition of the heart that is born into communion with God. The fullest form of prayer is a heart, a life, that is fully united to God and communes with Him constantly. So prayer here we have to understand not as this dialogue that we have with the Creator, but as a life united to His life. This is the highest form of prayer, as I say. However, it's not the only form of prayer. It's not the only level of prayer. Prayer at that level is something into which we strive, towards which rather we strive, into which we hope to grow. But apart from a very few examples in the history of our church of men or women specifically given a grace so to do, this is not the way that most people begin to pray. And this is not the way that the life of prayer starts or is sustained for people in their Christian walk. We arrive at that wordless communion of prayer precisely through prayer that is made of words. Prayer that begins with the lips, with the intellect, with the voice, that leads us ultimately, if we are diligent and persist, and if we are steadfast, that leads us ultimately through those things to that which is beyond them. But like so many aspects of our life in the church makes use of certain things in order that those very things can. The most obvious and ultimate example of this is making use of creation, making use of, for example, bread and wine that the church accepts as an offering, and indeed which she instructs her faithful to make. So we take the raw form of creation, grapes and grains, we, through our skill and labors, transform them by our own hands into something, wine and the church transforms those very things into that which is beyond them, that which they cannot be of themselves, into the blood and the flesh of Christ. So we see in the sacraments this basic concept that the church uses things to get beyond them, to work through them in order that we may touch what they themselves cannot convey on their own. It's the same with water for baptism. We take ordinary water, we put it in a place, we pray and bless and call the Spirit into it, and then this water becomes the means of cleansing the soul. Or oil when we anoint the sick, or when we consecrate it into myrrh and use it in baptisms and chrismations. In all of these sacramental realities, we see the church taking something, using it in order that that which is greater than it can be conveyed and attained. And it's the same with prayer. The highest form of prayer is this wordless communion of the heart with God. But in order to arrive at that, the church will make use of precisely words and phrases and labors to lead us and create in us the propensity and the ability to go beyond those things and touch that which they themselves do not convey. The timelessness of prayer, the ceaseless prayer that St. Paul commands when he says, pray without ceasing. That is also something that is attained by using prayer in time, by using prayer that must cease, that is necessarily episodic. St. Paul was an intelligent man, certainly, but even without all of the education and formal learning that he had, anyone can know that it is impossible to pray unceasingly if what one means by prayer is the recitation of words, either words that we are reading from a text and repeating, or words that we call into existence through our own creative use of the intellect. In either case, doing this unceasingly is an impossibility. And yet we use precisely those things in order to create a life that communes with God in a manner that can be unceasing, that is no longer episodic in the way spoken prayers by definition are, by which any physical action, verbal action, is necessarily periodic. Even our divine services, they are not continual. There is a beginning and an end to every divine service, the opening blessing and the closing benediction. And yet, through these services, we are also working to create hearts that commune in God's presence constantly, without a beginning and an end. So, the first thing to note with prayer is that there are different kinds of prayer, and that they are used by the church and embraced in order to build within us, in order to strengthen within us, hearts that are capable ultimately of that highest form of unceasing prayer. The prayer that we often call, by a shorthand, the prayer of the heart. That is to say, when the heart comes to life and prays, communes with God of its own volition, apart from the momentary efforts of the mind, when it embraces the activity of the mind and goes beyond them into this constant, unbroken, unceasing union with God. This is the prayer of the heart, as we often think of it. That we often use that phrase also to talk about the exercise of contemplative prayer, which I'll come back to in a moment. The prayer of the lips is a less well-worn phrase in Orthodoxy. I have no idea where it comes from. Maybe I just made it up when I was thinking of a title. I'm not sure. But I'm referring to the very literal meaning of that title, which is prayer that we offer through words. And they can be spoken, vocalized words, or they can be words vocalized interiorly in the intellect, in the mind, silent prayer. But in either case, whether we're vocalizing the words or whether we're keeping them silent, we are nevertheless using verbal prayer in this way. Now I'm going to pause for a moment because someone is saying the connection is very poor and impossible to listen, but only one person is saying that. So I'm going to carry on. There's really not much that I'm able to do about that in any case, but I hope that that's not true for everyone. I'll take the fact that only one person is complaining to think that that might well be because of the connection somewhere else or on your end. I'm sorry for that, but we're going to trudge on all the same. Prayer with words, verbal prayer, the prayer of the lips. Something that is a source of frustration, perhaps to me, and to others I'm sure, is when spiritual children come and are constantly asking for instruction on how to say the prayer of the heart. And when I ask in response, well, tell me how you are praying. What prayers are you saying? How are you praying them? Oh, I'm doing the prayers of the prayer book. I say my morning prayers. I say my evening prayers. But tell me, how do I get to the real prayer? Right? The real prayer beyond. And this is a source of sadness because very clear and very misconception, namely that the prayer that we read from prayer books is lower than this other form of prayer. We talked on Monday about the grace that God gives and whether God giving a different grace to a modern generation than he gave to a stronger generation in the past accounts to him giving less to us. And I tried to speak a little bit on Monday about why that's not an appropriate way to think of God's mercy and how he bestows it. And similarly, we encounter that same propensity here when we look at prayer. Yes, the prayer of the heart, that unceasing prayer that is communion in the heart, in the soul, in the nous with God himself. This is the highest form. And yet the means of getting there are not lesser. They are precisely what is needed, precisely what is blessed in order for the heart to grow. If all that we had was some instruction on this form of interior communion without cessation, and all ever that we heard spoken of, the only instruction that we ever heard was discussion about that, we would make no spiritual progress. For precisely the same reason that if God gave us the full measure of grace that we needed to be perfect when we weren't yet there, that grace would not be beneficial for us, as the saints have said. St. Irenei famously said, God could give us his fullness of grace whenever he wanted, but we as babes were not yet ready for it. The same is true with our prayer. We need to arrive at the heights of prayer. We need to scale this ascent, this mountain that leads up towards the heights of prayer, towards the heights of Sinai. You can't just snap your fingers and expect to be there. And if all that you think about and dwell on and ponder is that, then you will never move from beyond the place you stand now. And so in the place where we stand now, in our weakness, in our novitiate, if I can use a monastic term, as we're taking the starting steps for a life in prayer, what we need is precisely what the church gives us. Prayer that is verbal, prayer that we can do in pieces, prayer that we can apply to certain situations, prayer that we can realize in different ways in our lives, liturgically, privately, in the home, silently spoken. All of these forms of verbal prayer are not lesser, as if let's get beyond them to the better things. These are the better things for us in our state now. I hope that that's a clear principle, because it's a temptation to constantly strive for that which we are not ready for. The devil loves nothing than to put into, nothing more, I should say, than to put into the heart of someone with zeal, a zeal that is without reason, to run after the heights before one has taken the first steps at the base of the mountain. If you ever want genuinely to ascend, don't succumb to this temptation, but embrace what is given where you are so that you can change the circumstances of your present life. And this is certainly the case with prayer. If you want to grow in prayer, diligently use, rather than resent or avoid, the prayers that the Church gives, these verbal prayers, the prayers of the lips that we have. Now, what do I mean by these prayers and how we use them? I'm speaking first and foremost of the prayer book, as it's known in English, the Молитвослов. I hope that every Christian has a copy of this book. It's published in English in multiple editions. In our church, we tend to use the Jordanville edition. It's the most well-known, and I think personally is one of the nicer translations into English. Other editions are available. And of course, many people who listen to this will pray in Russian, so this is available in Russian, it's available in Slavonic, it's available in French, and almost every other language. Every Christian should have a prayer book. But I'm always surprised at the tenuous relationship that Christians have with this book. They all have a copy of it. We all turn to it from time to time. But there is a certain love-hate relationship with this book. This book contains within it, many people aren't even aware that's how little they actually spend time in it. The book contains within it morning and evening prayers, which are selections of prayers from longer divine services that have been extracted by the fathers of the church over the course of time to create standalone sets of prayers for the morning, kind of basic framework, as well as specific psalms, prayers, petitions that are put together for private use, individual use, or family use for the morning, and another set for the evening. Some books will have prayers throughout the day as well. And then you'll find in the prayer book also prayers for various occasions, prayers before travel, prayers when one is ill, etc. These also are taken from larger services that are done liturgically in the temples by clergy with the faithful, but the church has extracted these in portions and revised them slightly so that they can be used individually. The book contains many other things, prayers in preparation for Holy Communion, prayers in thanksgiving after receiving Holy Communion, as well as canons that are often said as part of those rules of preparation, Akaphist hymns that are often said as part of that rule of preparation, and various other things. The specific contents of prayer books vary on edition. Some contain the entire Psalter in the back, others will contain a whole host of other occasional services. But the heart and soul of the prayer book in terms of its regular use are the morning prayers and the evening prayers, and then the prayers before and after mysteries. The single greatest obstacle that many people seem to have to using the prayer book in terms of real, solid growth in prayer is a trepidation felt in the form of the following complaint. Those aren't my words. Those are not my words. I don't speak like that. I haven't thought those things. Someone else has put them together. And therefore, prayer for me, if I'm to use this book, if I'm to just flip through the pages and read these prayers, is just me reciting someone else's words. And the words may be nice, they may have been very beautiful in the heart of whoever wrote them, but they're not mine. And what kind of prayer is it if I'm just reciting someone else's language? If we have the interior prayer of the heart, which is wordless and eternal communion with God, and then we have prayer of the lips, surely this is a sort of third-rate form of prayer, where it's prayer of words that aren't even mine, that I'm just mindlessly repeating. Now, God forbid, I'm not saying this myself. I'm trying to give voice to frustrations that are very, very regularly uttered when it comes to praying with the prayer book, and used as reasons why people stop and why they don't. I'd rather pray in my own words. I have a very busy life. It's hard for me to find time to pray, but when I actually do, when I am able to stand in front of my icons for 15 minutes in the morning, 15 minutes in the evening, whatever it might be, I'd rather speak from my heart. I'd rather tell God what's really on my heart and in my mind than just read through psalms written thousands of years ago or prayers written hundreds of years ago. This is an understandable commentary, an understandable critique. But it's clearly wrong, and it clearly prevents us from growing. And it's important. The purpose of praying from a prayer book, the purpose of using other people's words, and not just generically other people's, but these specific sets of prayers that have been written by specific people and gathered specifically together by the church and given to us for our prayer. The purpose of this is not to make our prayer just a kind of transactional, in through the eyes comes these words and out through the mouth they are spoken, but rather to transform our mind and transform our hearts with the kinds of words that need to be there, the kinds of words and expressions and thoughts that ought to be in the hearts. This is what the prayer book is trying to do, to bear witness to me, an infant in prayer, of what true prayer should sound like, should taste like, should smell like. When we open the prayer book and we approach it properly, what we have is a gift from the fathers of the church. Because all of the prayers that are written there were written by men of profound interior prayer. There are prayers by St. John Chrysostom, by St. Basil, by St. Macarius, by so many of our holy fathers who were men of profound illumination and sanctification, whose hearts sang to God with the kind of voice that the whole world longs to attain. And the prayer book is their testimony. As if when I stand before God and I say, Lord, I don't know what words to say. I don't know how to speak to you. The saints hand me this and say, look, these are my words. Make them your own. Put them into your mouth, recite them, and let your heart start to experience what it's like to speak properly to God. To speak to him as the saints speak to him. To speak to him in the way he longs to be spoken to, in a way that changes the heart and the life of the person speaking. The problem with this impulse that we often have to say, I want to pray in my own words. I want to pray in my own. We should say, nothing wrong, for heaven's sake, there's nothing wrong in praying impromptu in your own words. And I deeply hope that every Christian person, as a part of their daily prayer, having prayed these prayers that are given to us by the church, also closes his or her eyes and simply lets his heart talk in his own words to God a little bit. But the temptation that comes from wanting to speak in my voice, from saying, I don't want to use someone else's words, I want to use mine, is that we're so captivated by our own emotions and our own understandings and our own shallow vision of reality, that we have very little knowledge of how to speak to God. And actually, if you've ever tried just to pray in your own words. And some of you will have come to Orthodoxy, perhaps, from other traditions, where that is almost the exclusive form of prayer. The thing that one discovers fairly quickly, if you do this regularly, is that your words become very repetitive. They're often very selfish, and they're often extraordinarily shallow. It's repetitive because I basically want to say the same things today that I said yesterday, perhaps with a few slight variations on the theme. They're very selfish because if I'm left to my own devices, what I want is my own satisfaction, my own sense of happiness, my own ease, my own freedom from care or illness or sickness or fear. And they're very shallow. But then what should we expect from our own weak state? The saints see God face to face and open their heart to him. But I, through my sin, put such distance between him and me. I, through the way that I live my life, orientate everything about me away from him. And how is it that I expect that when I then stand and want to pray, that suddenly my heart will sing the depth of spiritual beauty? No, it will reflect exactly what I have conditioned it to reflect through my life. My own pettiness, my own weakness, my own shallowness. And this is precisely where the set prayers that are given to us by the saints through the church are so valuable. They are the means of conditioning the heart and the mind into something else. Every time I do something with my day, I'm conditioning my heart. Every time I have a certain conversation or engage in some specific activity, I'm conditioning myself. It's what I become used to doing. It's what I become comfortable with. And the more I do it, the more comfortable I am doing it. And the less comfortable I am not doing it. That's just a basic fact of human existence. The prayer book and the prayers that it contains are there to condition us into something else. The prayer book is meant to reorientate the heart so that it starts to become comfortable with other words, other sentiments than my own. Let me ask a rhetorical question for the moment. Please don't all of you try to respond in the comments pane right now. How many of you, in a moment of profound thanksgiving, when something has gone wonderfully well in your life, and you feel extraordinary joy, and you want to give thanks to God, how many of you have stood and basically had no other words to say than, thank you. I'm really grateful for everything you've done. Thanks a lot. What else do we have? That's how we speak. That's how we talk to each other. This is how we express our gratitude in a day-to-day manner. And so when we stand before God, we have got nothing else to say to him. That's how we know to do this. Or conversely, how many of you in moments of profound grief, when your heart has been torn apart by whatever it may have been, some traumatic loss, some interior trauma, some grave fall, and in the depths you wanted to cry out to God for help. But what could you say to him? Please, I need your help, God. We're talking to the neighbor. Sugar, please, can you give me some? And yet we're feeling something much deeper than this, much more profound, whether positive or negative. And we haven't got words. We haven't got even an interior sense of emotion or an interior sense of disposition to commune with God about these things. So what we end up doing is taking these very profound experiences, whether exalted joy or extraordinary sorrow or anything in between, these deep and profound experiences. And because we haven't got any other means at our disposal, when we go to God with them, we reduce them to this narrow little breadth of the form of expression that we have to hand. Thanks for everything, God. I'm really grateful. Or I'm really sorry, God, about that thing that I did. Or God, I know I have done something bad. Please forgive me. How does that compare, for example, to speaking to God like this? O Lord, I know that I am not worthy, that thou shouldest come beneath the roof of the house of my soul, for it is all desolate and barren, and thou wilt find therein no place worthy to lay thy head. In that one phrase, which comes from the prayer book, more or less, in that one phrase is expressed more about my sense of unworthiness before God that we all feel in certain moments. It's a gift of grace when we genuinely feel unworthy before God, but not a despairing unworthiness, not a by God's mercy we're able to see and we're able to sense and really understand deep within us that we aren't worthy of God's love, and yet he loves us. We aren't worthy of his presence, and yet he comes to us. And it's that beautiful marriage, that beautiful collision in the heart of profound unworthiness and the sense of profound unworthiness, and yet at the same time a sense of profound expectation and hope and love. Most of us have very little vocabulary to express this, or even interiorly to register it. We sense something is going on in the heart. But it's not just that we can vocalize it. We don't even know what it is. We are feeling something, but we don't know what. All of this is given shape through the prayers in this little book. It is as if St. John Chrysostom is saying to us in the form of this prayer, this is what you are feeling. You are feeling like this before God. You may not know it, but this is what your heart wants to say to him right now. In this instant, your heart is aware of its meekness, of its weakness, but also of the love of God that comes into it. As he might come into a house, you're aware that the house is not worthy to hold him, but you're also aware that he's entering in himself. This is what you want to say. This is what you want to feel. So it's not even that the prayer is saying, this is what you ought to feel. Though sometimes it's good to be spoken to in very plain terms like this. But more often than not, the prayer book at certain moments is saying, this is what you want to feel. Your heart wants to speak like this to God. And so let me show you how. I often think of the prayer book as if the saints are standing right beside me, right beside you when you open it up, saying, let me show you right now how your heart should talk to God. And so we read these words that, yes, another person has written, but that's precisely the point. That our heart starts to feel new things, starts to sense God's presence and our condition in new ways, and therefore to talk to God differently. And if you diligently use this book and these prayers that are assigned by the church, assigned as if it's a school project, if you diligently use them, you will notice not 10 years from now or 15 years from now, you will notice very quickly, if you're sincere about this and steadfast in it, you will notice when you stand to talk to God in your words, they will start to sound like the words of St. John, like the words of St. Basil and others. And that is precisely what the church wishes for you by giving you these prayers, that the heart will be transformed to speak to God differently. And how many of you have noticed this? If you use the prayer book faithfully, that the way you talk to God changes. And suddenly the foreignness of these words does not feel so foreign. And when you speak to God without these words in front of you, surprise, your voice starts to sound more and more like what you have read there. This is precisely the way that the prayer of the lips becomes prayer of the heart. Right? And this is why, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's disheartening when I hear people saying, tell me how to get beyond all of that and to the real prayer. These are the things that create a heart capable of communing with God. Because a true communion with God in the heart has as a foundation, the perception of who God is, that we actually see him for who he is, and ourselves as who we are. And so long as we are using our own language and our own style of praying simply to reinforce what I already think about myself and what I already think about God, right or wrong, deep or shallow, then that prayer is never, that sense, that perception of God is never going to develop, and therefore the heart can never fully commune in him. But when prayer is something which, through the words that we use, given to us and embraced by us, changes how we see ourselves, changes how we see God, and how we stand before him and interact with him, then the heart starts to see clearly. And that heart is able to actually commune with God properly without being interrupted by the intellect and its shortcomings. So the prayer of the lips is an essential aspect of our life of prayer and our growth in prayer, and not a thing to be got past, but a thing to be embraced constantly. In a very real sense, all of our liturgical worship is this kind of prayer. The priest does not stand in the front of the church and simply invent the service of his own volition. He does not invent a single sentence.